Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Matthew Bay. I am a senior analyst here at RANE. With me, we have Ali Pluchinsky and Haley Benedict, two of our cyber analysts. I don't know if they would like to introduce themselves. No?
Hello, everyone. My name is Allie. I'm one of RANE's two cyber analysts.
I'm Haley. I'm the other cyber analyst.
Yeah, so today we're going to be discussing kind of what we've seen over the last year as we come up to the 1 year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine when it comes to Russian cyber attacks, and then where we might be seeing things going from here. I think one of the notable things that we've been following over the last 48 hours or so has been the dismantling of the websites owned by the ransomware group Hive. I don't know which one of you wants to start, but what really have we seen since the war began? Have we actually seen, significant increase in Russian cyber attacks against the West, or is it more tailored elsewhere?
I'm happy to start us off, and I think speaking for a lot of the expert network, we expected to see more Russian cyber behavior leading up to the war, and I think in many regards we've actually seen less than what was expected. And a lot of the cyber activity that we have seen has been lower level and less sophisticated, primarily through different hacktivist networks such as Killnet, which has been a big proponent of targeting Western organizations with cyber tactics. However, again, a lot of these tactics have primarily involved distributed denial of service attacks or other more flashy attacks or tactics that don't really have that kind of technical expertise behind them that can really cause long-lasting damage. Of course, at the beginning of the war, we saw the Viasat satellite attack, which I think for a lot of people set the tone for a high level of Russian cyber activity. But again, in my opinion, we really haven't seen as much as we may have thought that we would. I don't know if Haley wants
So
to
I
add to
guess
that.
there are two different things, and I'm interested to see exactly where you're going with that. When we're talking about Russian cyber activity, there is both the in theater cyber activity, so targeting, like you mentioned, the satellite attack. That would be something that we're talking about in terms of Russian cyber activity inside the country. Is that where you're saying that we aren't seeing as much potentially as what you would have anticipated, or are you talking about Russian cyber hacking or cyber activity and hacking, ransomware attacks, et cetera, against Western organizations, distinct from the conflict in Ukraine? So against, here in the U.S.
It's an important delineation, and thank you for clarifying, because I was speaking more to Russian cyber activity outside of the theater of Ukraine. We've certainly seen a high level of Russian cyber activity within Ukraine, but still to that same regard, I think it's important to note that the actual impact of Russian cyber activity, even within the Ukrainian theater, has, in my opinion, been less severe than, again, a lot of what experts predicted. I think an important aspect of that topic is the role of the private sector in defending Ukrainian cyberspace thus far, which really is unprecedented in a lot of ways. I think Microsoft's role and also just Western allies really bolstering Ukrainian cyber defense, not only right now in this last year, but also, several years leading up to the war was, I know, a big effort. And it's something, I'm sure that you can speak to as well. But again, I still think it's an anomaly that Russia really hasn't been able to follow through with a lot of the cyber threats in theater and out of theater that maybe we were worried about. But I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I know that right now there's a lot of kind of debate within the military community and intelligence community around why that's the case inside the theater. Why, and I think that that is something that's more related to this question about how is cyberspace going to be used and utilized in a wartime environment. Really, everything prior to the Ukraine conflict had been more speculative. We hadn't really seen a modern, military fight in a place where both sides have, significant, cyber capabilities. So I think there might have been a lot of gaps in perceptions of like how it would be utilized in the modern, conflict, and that kind of, is being exposed right now. And I think that, it's going to be a topic that a number of dissertations, a number of opinion pieces, a number of different kind of studies are going to be looking at is, is this an example of how cyber is not the future, I guess, when it comes to a lot of the fighting, or sorry, a lot of the ways that it's integrated into a conflict, that it's in the modern warfare kind of space, or is it more of a force multiplier? Because I think at the end of the day, when Russia was trying to make military advances, cyber could only go so far to help that, and that's why maybe some of the stuff that they had done initially on the satellite aspects, for the satellite internet was much more about tactical gains in trying to disrupt communications for the physical fight.
One line of argument that I saw during reading throughout different news sources was the argument that Russia may be avoiding more disruptive cyber capabilities because of the inability to predict what the fallout of those attacks may be. So something like NotPetya, of course, was a big concern about the potential for a viral malware to be unleashed, or even just a major level cyber attack that would have a lot of secondary and tertiary effects. And so one argument that I've seen is that Russia is really being a lot more careful in how it conducts its cyber activities within the theater of war because of fear of escalation and having those unintended consequences. I was wondering if you thought that there was merit to that argument.
So I think there's merit to it, but I don't know if there's merit to it inside of Ukraine, because I mean, war is messy, right? And this hasn't stopped them from, carrying out strikes on what we would consider civilian targets inside Kyiv or elsewhere in the country. So I don't think like any of the concerns about escalation are inside the Ukraine theater is really what might be restraining Russia. I think it's more operational opportunities if they are or lack thereof. How much of this is really more about being able to control physical territory on the ground where you can't really rely on cyber for all of that. But I think there's more merit to the argument when you talk about maybe releasing self-replicating worms or going to targeting Western organizations that are active in Ukraine or doing some of the transportation from Ukraine, because then it's more of an escalation ladder to a NATO conflict outside of Ukraine. So I think if there is any kind of restraint on the side of the Russians, it's more likely to be coming from when targeting NATO countries, as opposed to within the Ukraine theater. Another narrative, and this kind of goes to the second bucket of issues when we talk about why ransomware activity at large and other kind of Russian cyber, financial crime or financially motivated hacking may have been declined or didn't grow as much as people expected outside of Russia. It could be just the fact that, or sorry, outside of Ukraine. It could be the fact that some of those operations have been disrupted by the war, or they're being called to arms to work for the Russian state to do things in Ukraine, or the access to technology has been a little bit more cut off because of Western sanctions. Not to mention the U.S. as the Hive takedown this week is kind of giving some example of, has been much more proactive and trying to disrupt the activities by cyber hackers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that was your point about Western sanctions was something I was going to bring up as well in terms of where we may see the future of Russian cyber activity. I mean, between just overall economic sanctions, but especially sanctions within the tech sector, my intuition says that Russia is going to have a harder and harder time having access to really sophisticated cyber technology to conduct these operations in 2023. However, with battlefield setbacks and the recent Western decision to commit more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, seems as though Russia will need to continue to rely on the cybersphere to some extent as an asymmetric tool to buttress against some of that Western support. But it's not entirely evident to me how they may overcome those hurdles. I've seen, Russia may potentially seek Chinese alternatives for technological resources, to continue these operations. But from a lot of what I've read, it seems as though that may be less sophisticated technology, or that China may be unwilling to deliver certain advanced emerging technology. But I don't know if you know more about that.
Yeah, so I think that the U.S. in the West's restrictions on China or Russia's access to tech, it's primarily end use export control type restrictions for things like computer chips, etc. Those are also some of the technologies where the U.S. is pressuring China in some regard. So if I'm Beijing and the Chinese government, I'm not sure I really want to start shipping large volumes of that kind of equipment to Russia, because that's only going to strengthen calls on Capitol Hill here in the United States to place similar restrictions on China in response. So I don't know if China would do that kind of a policy because of their own fears about restrictions against them. So just on that. And thank you, Haley. Thank you for joining back. I'm sorry that technical problems are certainly not your fault. So we're now talking about kind of one of the reasons as to why some of the ransomware attacks coming out of Russia may not be as aggressive as we or as expansive as we may have thought. I don't know though whether or not Russia views it as kind of, a need to respond to the U.S. when it comes to some of the approvals of various tanks and things like that. I think it's like a retaliatory, like they should, punish the U.S. and punish the West, but I don't think it's something that can really push back. And what I mean by push back, it's not as if the U.S. and the West are going to change their strategy when it comes to supporting the Ukrainian military because of Russian cyber attacks.
Well, to that point, I was wondering if either you or Haley had any thoughts about the role of disinformation recently in the last year of Russia's activities. Of course, prior to the war, Russia was arguably the most well-known adversarial state to engage broadly in disinformation activity. And something that we've been watching throughout the last year is how Russia will use fake news or disinformation in an attempt to create divisions among the West's unification and support of Ukraine. And thus far, it seems as though those efforts haven't really had a major impact, notably because the West has just decided to ramp up support for Ukraine with these new, more sophisticated weapons rather than sort of moving away from Ukrainian support. So, either Matthew or Haley, do you think in this next year, Russian disinformation or attempts to sow discord will have more success? Or why do you think they haven't had that much success in the last 6 or so months as the war has dragged on?
Yeah, I actually think to a certain extent that a lot of Russia's disinformation propaganda efforts have kind of been thwarted by its activities because a lot of them are focused on pro-Russian narratives and they've been pushing this for so long. And in the West, at least, a lot of these audiences have been lost. And so it's redirected a lot of attention to maybe some non-Western countries, China, India, some countries in Latin America are getting a lot of push for the pro-Russian narrative now that maybe they weren't getting as much of before or had been directed elsewhere. But I feel like it's kind of lost some of its success that it was seeing originally.
So, I mean, I think when we think about Russian disinformation campaigns, I think there are, a few buckets you have to think about. I think there is a global discourse, the pro-Russia or anti-West kind of narrative, which is, you know, still very strong in places of Africa. I mean, just look at what we saw, a week ago, or actually not even a week ago, in Burkina Faso, where they kicked out the French military precisely because they had also increasing reliance on Russia. So we've seen in the Sahel still this year growing, I guess not so much support, but more successes when it comes to information campaigns that are leading to Russian forces or at least Russian outfits gaining more prominence against France. That is one way when we talk about their kinds of goals with their disinformation campaigns is trying to drum up support for the anti-West narrative and the pro-Russian narrative. But I think, and this is something that I think is going to become more important over the next year, is that there's also the information campaigns that isn't so much about driving a Russian narrative as much as it is sowing discord within a country. I think here in the United States, given that we're going back into a presidential election cycle where instead of just a midterm election cycle, and now that we've already, of course, got President Trump, he's formally announced his campaign. So I think more of the sowing discord for discord's sake, regardless of what that narrative is something that's going to become more prominent as the U.S. election cycle heading up into 2024 elections. We're less than a year away from the first primaries. So those are things that are going to be coming up pretty quickly on us. With that, are there any other final thoughts that either of you would like to make before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Haley?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I missed while having technical difficulties, so I don't want to go back over anything that you've already hit on, but I think, yeah, we've done a nice job summing it up.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. If you would like to hear more of our analysis, all three of us, please visit us at ranenetwork.com. That is RANE, RANE, network.com. Thank you. Have a good day.